Good morning once again, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. The Sea Will Always Provide Subsistence Fishing in the Bahamas during COVID-19. Our speakers today are Dr. Carlisa Callwood and Makeda Sergiu from the Community Conservation, Education, and Action Program here at the Perry Institute for Marine Science. My name is Danielle Cartwright, and I will be the moderator for this morning's webinar. Just a few housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and this is a reminder for you to keep your microphone muted during the session. Afterwards, there will be a Q&A session. Add any questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand, and an audience feedback link will be shared in the chat. So without further ado, I will now welcome our speakers to begin their presentation.
Thank you, Danielle. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Carlisa Callwood, the Director of the Community Conservation, Education, and Action Program here at the Perry Institute for Marine Science. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the role of subsistence fishing in the Bahamas during COVID-19. We all know that COVID-19 created a wide range of social and economic impacts for many around the world. And small island countries like the Bahamas saw some additional challenges, particularly due to their reliance on tourism as an economic driver, but also a heavy reliance on food imports. So this project was created to better understand what some of the direct impacts were on Bahamian residents, but more specifically to get a sense for what the impacts might mean for local fisheries based on some observations that both I, as well as Nick Higgs from Cape Eleuthera Institute, had witnessed casually during the time of the pandemic. And before we start the presentation, I wanted to thank several of the people who worked on different stages of this project, including Zoe Brown, Candice McPhee, and Catrell King, as well as the National Geographic Society COVID-19 Science Fund for providing the support for this project. So just a quick overview of what Makeda and I will cover today. We'll set the stage for this project and share the research goals and methodology. We'll provide a review of the impacts experienced by the respondents that we interviewed and surveyed, as well as the strategies they used to mitigate those impacts. We'll share community perceptions on the ability to use marine resources to survive social or natural quote-unquote disasters. And we'll wrap up with some of the key findings and considerations from this project. So when the first case of COVID was confirmed in the Bahamas, the country immediately went into action, implementing several social protection measures. These included strategies such as weekday curfews, weekend lockdowns that started Friday evenings and lasted until Monday mornings, restrictions on private gatherings, closure of most non-essential in-person businesses, and limited hours for food stores, restaurants, farmers markets, etc. Many of these measures contributed to limiting the ability for many people to purchase seafood. The pandemic also produced abrupt changes in the socio-ecological systems on many islands, including the Bahamas, which exacerbated food insecurity issues due to a high dependence on food imports. Here, we're defining food insecurity as limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or limited or uncertain ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways. This is a common concern for small island developing states like the Bahamas, where 92% of the food consumed is imported. And this high reliance on imports makes SIDS particularly susceptible to external shocks, such as natural disasters, economic collapse, and other supply chain disruptions. And this vulnerability became very apparent during the pandemic. Yet, subsistence fishing has long played an integral role in sustaining island communities, especially those with limited terrestrial resources. During the pandemic, subsistence fishing was one of the few activities allowed during the lockdown restrictions in the Bahamas, as well as some other small island countries, leading to a surge in the number of people observed engaging in small-scale fishing. One well-monitored fishery in Eleuthera saw catches of queen conch increase threefold above background catch levels, along with an increase in illegal fishing activity, suggesting a reliance on marine resources as a safety net during times of crisis. This preliminary evidence made us wonder whether subsistence fishing may have played an important role in mitigating the worst of the social impacts of the pandemic or of other disasters. So with that in mind, we wanted to understand how this system was impacted by the pandemic by gaining insights from communities throughout the Bahamas. There were two primary goals here. The first was to understand the role of subsistence fisheries in providing resilience to island communities during social disturbances like the COVID-19 pandemic. And the second goal was to determine the actors, drivers, and motivations for changes in these fisheries during this time period. We were particularly interested in how these dynamics might have varied across the spectrum of urban to rural and remote island communities. So we focused specifically on New Providence, where Nassau is quote unquote the big city, versus Eleuthera, one of the family islands. By connecting the social dimensions of the pandemic with community information on both fishing and seafood and consumption, we hope to gain a better understanding of how humans interact with the marine environment during a disturbance.
During the summer of 2023, we implemented online surveys and semi-structured interviews, which mainly focused on understanding the impacts faced, shifts in food purchasing and seafood consumption, how fishing was used to supplement their needs, and perceptions about the local marine environment. When asked about their main concerns during the pandemic, the two main concerns that we noticed were the concern about being able to return to normal and earning potential. New Providence residents were mostly concerned about getting back to their normal routine, whereas residents on Eleuthera were more concerned about their earning potential and other factors that directly impacted their ability to support for their families. When asked about the main challenges faced during the pandemic, respondents mentioned experiencing financial, social, and mental challenges. The respondents from Eleuthera were mainly affected by financial issues. One participant responded as follows: no money, less income streams, shops were running out of items. There was no tourism, and this island depends on tourism. Another respondent from New Providence, however, mentioned experiencing mental and social challenges. They responded as follows: health of family was negatively impacted because of being confined to the house in lockdown. Also, family in hospital and prison couldn't be visited, which negatively impacted their well-being. Although the pandemic had a lot of negative implications, some people found that when they were around their family so much, it brought about some positive impacts. One respondent stated, "It brought us closer. We had no choice but to see each other every day. It helped me trust in them. It showed me that they are dependable." Another factor that we considered was the support available during these times of disaster. In both places, they experienced help from the church. However, in New Providence, they experienced more help from the environment, and in Eleuthera, they experienced help from their communities. One participant responded as follows: a member of the church in Tarpon Bay made sure that communities had groceries. She passed out bags to everyone. It's more community, not government. We are all related, so we share what we grew. If someone was growing something, we exchanged crops and fish. That sounds like the family island I heard my grandparents talking about when I grew up. Respondents on New Providence, as I mentioned earlier, experienced support from the government. For example, one respondent stated, "The government gave groceries and church checked in regularly on my needs and helped where they could." The key factors that allowed people to deal with challenges during that time period was predominantly family support, as well as having the ability to change and or find other jobs, particularly when tourism, our biggest industry, was shut down. Yet, the ability to fish was also in the top 3. There was also a wide variety of impacts to households, factors such as reduction in employment opportunities and income, increases in vulnerability, and limited ability to contribute to savings. Based on the interviews, reduced household income was the largest impact. The survey data showed that this impact was statistically significant based on the number of people in the households and the percentage of household residents contributing to the finances. Respondents indicated that there were less family members able to work, and other factors like the loss of jobs and businesses, reduced hours, and reduced salaries that all contributed to increase in vulnerability. For example, respondents with 2 to 3 household members were most likely to agree that reduction in employment opportunities was statistically significant by the number of individuals in the household and the percentage contributing to income. Furthermore, respondents with more than 50% of the family members contributing to the income were most likely to agree that there was an increase in vulnerability statistically based on the percentage of household residents contributing to the income. However, it is also important to note that while reduction in daily food intake was a major issue for many, respondents still limited spending and focused on necessities and substitutions. More than 50% indicated that they did struggle to obtain food, particularly their items or brands of preference. Some of the strategies they used to maintain the quality of food they secured was primarily limiting luxury items, but also using savings or, again, fishing to meet their needs. Respondents from both islands, however, indicated that they increased their fishing efforts and their seafood consumption. One respondent stated as follows: "We ate a lot of fish. We had access to it. We had a system. We had to fish during the night." Another stated, "Once the government allowed fishing, I went out regularly. It provided a chance to get out." Carlos, you're muted.
Thank you. The changes that many of these respondents saw in seafood consumption was based primarily on availability, both in terms of affordability as well as accessibility. Some found it easier and cheaper to get seafood from the grocery store, but this was primarily focused on obtaining packaged items like canned tuna, mackerel, sardines, etc. This change occurred particularly when prices for fresh seafood began to increase. One fisher noted that he was able to sell spiny lobster at $20 per pound during this time period, when his previous price was about $5 to $6 per pound. For those who continued to consume fresh seafood, they started to eat items they considered to be more easily available and accessible. So this included going crabbing, fishing or purchasing grunts, lionfish, stone crab, and to a lesser extent, snappers. Next, although fishing as well as locating fresh seafood was a challenge for many, there were many others who were able to navigate the restrictions in order to help them meet their needs. So residents of one settlement in central Eleuthera frequently fished the areas directly behind their houses in the early morning hours, as pictured in the first image on this slide. And they mentioned having to avoid patrolling officers and or having someone as a lookout in order to be able to facilitate that in a way that they wouldn't get caught. In New Providence, some commercial fishers who were prevented from using Montague Dock or Potter's Key for their fish sales reported shifting to a delivery service or simply selling their catch from their backyard. And many of them said they were often able to make a lot more money than they would have been if they were using those stalls. And lastly, respondents from Southern Eleuthera shared that they would often take boats out just before curfew began in the evenings, stay out on the boat all night, and return once curfew had lifted in the mornings in order to avoid patrols. So now we'll talk about some of the perceptions that these respondents had related to the importance of the marine environment. Overall, respondents highly value their local marine environment, viewing it as important for them as well as for the country of the Bahamas. Yet they acknowledge its condition is not as great as it could be, with the majority noting that they've seen a lot of changes just within the past 5 years. They mention shifts in numbers and sizes of key fishery species, declines in the health of corals, and more pollution in some areas. Some example quotes include, the number of conch, shellfish, and fish have decreased and tides have gotten higher. So not only noting a decline in the population of these species, but also some direct impacts from climate change issues. One respondent also noted, as an avid fisher, I've noted a steep drop in size and amount of fish caught. And another said, availability of fish from fishermen has changed, especially for small fish like yellow-tailed jacks. Some respondents also spoke specifically about seeing the corals dying and diseased, referencing not only the occurrence of stony coral tissue loss disease in the Bahamas during this time period, but also impacts from coral bleaching. And one respondent also mentioned, I've seen a drastic reduction, not only in fish quantity and size, but also a lot of habitat destruction in common areas. Respondents also believe that Bahamians should turn to the ocean during their times of need. Some related quotes here include, we already turn to the sea, whether we're in crisis or not. And as long as we're taking care of the sea, it should take care of us as well. This was further supported by our interviews with individuals where respondents from Eleuthera particularly, who encountered increased difficulty in obtaining food due to some of the supply chain issues, but many question whether these ocean resources are enough to sustain the entire country long term, especially when you consider that many of these resources are already stressed. Some of the quotes here include, even in the best of times, the resources we're already struggling with these resources, and it will support us, but I don't think we have the supply to satisfy the whole population. And several respondents noted the need to be able to further supplement fisheries resources with local agriculture as well as farming. Excuse me. So one quote that kind of exemplifies all of this is the following. It's not the best for the environment, but subsistence fishing is a drop in the bucket compared to the large commercial fisheries. The Bahamas has such poor food security, it's important to use the resources available to help sustain communities, which is why it's so important to keep our marine environments healthy. So to move on to our conclusions, the work here helped to highlight the difficulties in sustaining a livelihood brought on by the variety of social protection measures implemented. Family islands like Eleuthera were hit the hardest as they were highly dependent on weekly food shipments from New Providence. Thus, issues in the supply chain trickled down to these more rural islands and created a greater crisis related to how they would continue to feed their families. Many of the respondents on Eleuthera shared that they turned to these strategies used by their parents and grandparents, things like fishing and crabbing regularly, as well as starting backyard farming to help supplement their food needs. However, this was made more challenging by a larger police and military presence on the island. Yet respondents mentioned finding ways around that enforcement to ensure that they were getting the resources that they need, whether that was fishery resources or agricultural resources in order to survive.
Overall, despite being impacted differently, respondents from both islands indicated that their default reaction when struggling to provide for their households was to turn to the ocean and its resources. The ocean provided, or the ocean provided for the respondents in three main ways. It helped them meet their food needs. It was a means of recharging their mental health, and it helped them rebuild social connections. They view the fishery resources as plentiful, low cost to obtain, and valuable for them by rights as Bahamian citizens. But several resources, such as Sherman et al. 2018 and FAU 2016, have shown evidence that our marine resources are not as plentiful as we think. Many of the fishing resources that we tend to enjoy culturally, such as the queen conch and the spiny lobster, are experiencing declines. For instance, according to a study by Sherman et al., Nassau groupers have declined by 86% throughout our country. Given the facts, there are many concerns about the ability for the country to sustainably maintain these local fisheries and support our future. Respondents also shared that while they believe these resources can be used to supplement food issues during the time of crises, there is more that the government could and should be doing to protect our fisheries from harmful practices, but also to help create long-lasting sustainability.
So the question remains whether the ocean can be used as a buffer against future threats to food security in the Bahamas. But to be able to answer this, we need to get a better handle on current levels of subsistence fishing, as well as to be able to project how these levels might shift during the next food crisis. Subsistence fishing data are not collected currently, are not regularly collected currently throughout the Bahamas. And there are a lot of data gaps existing, and we tend to know more about what's occurring on some islands more than others. Also, it will be important to consider how agriculture and backyard farming could also act as additional buffers against future food shocks, while also reducing a reliance on already stressed fisheries resources. While we were traveling around Eleuthera, one of the things we noticed as we drove towards the northern end of the island were these old mills, which is pictured in the upper right hand of this slide. And so we know that there's a history of agriculture on that island, as well as some of the other islands. And also, just currently, farmers markets are becoming a fairly regular event on several of the islands. So we need to think about how some of these efforts can be supported further to aid in expanding the local food supply across many of the islands.
So what else can be done to protect and preserve our marine environments and our marine resources? In regards to government officials, there needs to be an increased enforcement on pre-existing fishing regulations, which would include the protection of our waters from poachers, which was a big issue that a lot of the respondents, particularly the fishermen, tend to highlight when we were interviewing them. There also needs to be more collaborative efforts between the scientific and fishing communities when it comes to the creation of fishing policies and regulations. And as Carlisa mentioned earlier, there needs to be more data collection related to subsistence fishing. In regards to fishers and locals, we can both do our part at being good stewards of our precious marine resources. Fishers can promote and practice pre-existing sustainable fishing habits, such as adhering to the closed season, ensuring that the conch that you receive is about 15 millimeters thick, and also keeping the people in our own circles responsible for purchasing sustainable seafood. And locals can also help by promoting and increasing the awareness of these habits. So furthermore, these are our contacts. This is the end of our slideshow. If there's any questions, we will take them.
Thank you, Dr. Colwood. Thank you, Makeda. Before we get into the question and answer session, I would just like to remind the audience that there has been a survey link placed in the chat for you to fill out, please. And please insert any questions that you may have in the chat or in the Q&A option. I see a raised hand by Nicola Smith. We are going to unmute you if you do have a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Great presentation. Thank you for that. I have a quick question. Two related questions. Firstly, did you quantify subsistence fishing in Eleuthera and New Providence during COVID-19 and like on a per capita basis and extrapolate that measure to the entire populations on those islands? Firstly, and then secondly, I did a study back in 2017 with Dirk Zeller from the Sea Around Us, in which we estimated subsistence fishing on a per capita basis based on the Family Islands versus Nassau and Freeport. And I was wondering how the per capita subsistence fishing during COVID compares to those estimates.
Thank you for your question, Nicola. So we did not quantify the subsistence fishing directly. So one of the things that Nick Higgs did in Eleuthera during COVID was he was able to quantify the amount of queen conch that he saw being collected. And this was just on his daily walks. And his paper that came out, I believe, in 2020 or 2021 speaks directly to that. Most of what we saw was anecdotal. So we weren't quite sure if people were increasing their subsistence fishing. So part of our interviews and part of our surveys was to get specifically at that, since we did not have those quantifiable numbers. And based on the interviews, many people confirmed that they were fishing more than normal, because many of the people that we spoke to were not fishers. They were just general residents who decided on Sundays that they were going to go out fishing, or that they were going to go on their friend's boat and bring in a catch to help support their families. So that's definitely one of the things that does need to happen, is to be able to adequately quantify what those sustainable subsistence fishing levels looks like.
So even though you don't have the precise data, you could estimate based on saying the size of your surveys and what percentage of respondents in those surveys said they subsistence fished
Yep.
to get an idea of what's the percentage of people that participate in subsistence fishing on in these communities. And then did you ask anything about, for instance, how much they were eating, like were they relying on subsistence fishing to supply 1 or 2 meals per week, or did you get any sort of questions structured around that sort of quantity?
No, we didn't quantify that deeply. We were looking more to get a sense of what was driving them towards subsistence fishing.
Right.
Yeah, but these are definitely things that we can incorporate.
Okay, last question. I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but when is this study published as yet, or when are you intending to publish it, or?
We're working on writing it up, so hopefully by the end of this year or early next year.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicola.
Alrighty, next question is from Lauren, and she is asking, what was the most surprising thing that you heard from fishers during the interviews?
I'll let Makeda answer that.
I think the most surprising thing for me was the concern from fishers for poachers. A lot of them, when we asked like what they were concerned about, they mentioned the concern that they had for poachers, especially when we asked them about like if they think the government's doing enough and stuff like that. They were very concerned that the poachers were taking a lot of our marine resources that should be for Bahamians only by right. because I knew it was a big deal, but when I started to notice that like a lot of the fishers were saying it, I didn't realize how much of a big deal it was to them specifically.
And I'll add one other thing that was a big surprise was the number of people who took up farming, even just on a very small scale level in their backyards, where they started to grow any variety of different types of crops. And I loved that almost all of the people that we spoke to talked about how like this was something their grandparents always did, or that their parents always mentioned, and that they had gotten away from those activities. So having the incidence of the pandemic really brought home for them how important continuing a lot of those traditions were, not just for survival, but also for keeping those connections to the prior generations.
Wonderful. Thank you. Lauren saying thank you. Great presentation. A really interesting study. So if anyone else has any more questions, now would be the time to ask them. But there does not seem to be any more at the moment. So in closing, thank you all so much for joining us today to learn more about the Sea Will Always Provide subsistence fishing in the Bahamas during COVID-19. Nicola, I see that you have a question. Carlisa, are you able to answer it now, or would you? Okay, yes. So Nicola, would you like to, we can unmute you again. I think you're already unmuted.
Oh, okay, great. The question I had was that surprising for you? Because I thought it was a bit I wouldn't say counterintuitive, but that the price of seafood increased during COVID as opposed to decreasing to meet the needs of the population. Um, was that surprising or was that expected? I mean, I guess if you have more people, more demand, then the price will go up. But I just thought that during a crisis, that was kind of surprising that that's what would happen if we were needing it to meet local food security needs.
Yeah, it was a little surprising, but I think particularly with the spiny lobster, if it's something that people really wanted to get their hands on, it kind of made sense that some of those fishers were able to capitalize on that, and that they would, given that a lot of their other income sources had been substantially decreased.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you see that with other species, or was it just with like the high end species?
It was mostly with the higher end species like crawfish and grouper, Nassau grouper.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Alrighty, last chance for any more questions. Alrighty, if not, again, thank you so much everyone for joining us today for this morning's webinar. For more information, you can visit our website at perryinstitute.org, and you can also follow our social media channels at Perry Institute for Marine Science, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we hope that you will join us again for our future webinars. Thank you again, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.